For many people, the workplace is the first opportunity they have to work with diversity. Growing up in rural areas or in urban areas or even outside of the United States, diversity looks very different once we come into the workplace. And so as hiring managers, we carry all of those things with us into the job search process, right? So the process for not only filling jobs, but who we want to recruit to, who we want to reach out to, those are all impacted by our decisions as a hiring manager. And so what we want to give you today are some simple skills that will allow you to think about how to be more effective as a hiring manager. And we'll sum all of these skills up just in this one term: inclusive leadership. So we want to give our hiring managers the skills of an inclusive leader. So there are 5 skills that are necessary for someone to be an inclusive leader. First is having an inclusive mindset. Secondly, having cultural competence and agility. Thirdly, having greater adaptability. Next, being cognizant of my own unconscious bias and fostering a sense of belonging. So when we first talk about this first concept of having an inclusive mindset, so let's talk about inclusive mindset. Inclusive mindset really refers to one's idea that everyone has something to offer to either the organization or the group. And so no matter what that looks like, an inclusive leader is able to take all of those gifts and talents and prioritize those to help the organization reach its goals. So an inclusive leader takes whatever card they're dealt and they play that card as best they can. They reorganize it. They find the best in individuals. They invest in those individuals to help them reach their personal and professional potential. And so an inclusive leader is one that looks at the landscape of the workforce, landscape of the folks that they supervise, and brings out the best in them so that the organization can move forward. That is an inclusive mindset. So what is greater adaptability? One of the things that we know that is a constant is change. And so as a leader, how do you adapt to the changing context that you find yourself in? We have to recognize that demographics are constantly changing. There's a shift. We have 5 generations in the workforce. Women have a more dominant or progressing more in our environments and in leadership. And so how do you adapt as a leader? How do you adapt to these changes? And so when we think about greater adaptability, those leaders who are able to recognize the context, recognize demographic or organizational shifts, and account for those as they make decisions, become the leaders that will propel us into a positive and fruitful future. What we recognize about dinosaurs is that they're no longer with us. And they're no longer with us because they could not adapt. And so greater adaptability really allows us to think strategically about the disruptions that technology presents, that communication devices present, and use those for the betterment of the organization and ultimately for the people that we serve. So now let's talk about cultural competence and agility. So if you just look at the words, we recognize that cultural competence means that you have some knowledge about another group, right? So having knowledge about that group does not necessarily equate to knowing how to interact with that group, right? And so when we talk about cultural competence, it is about the facts and figures about a particular group. It's about understanding the context of that group. But it it also suggests, agility suggests that not only do we have those facts and figures, but we actually know how to interact to get the best out of people, and so that they can contribute their best as well. And so we have to recognize the nuances of culture. So sometimes as a supervisor, and we're interviewing people, and the common rule oftentimes is if people don't make eye contact, that means that they are ... right? So either they're not confident, or they're not telling the truth, or, well, with a cultural competence and agility lens, we may actually recognize that that is a form of respect that they're paying me. Right? So by not making eye contact, they could be actually giving me respect. They could be giving me honor. They could be demonstrating they're paying attention. But without that cultural competence and agility lens, I might suggest that candidate not move on because they're not conforming to our unwritten norms. Right? So we'll talk more about that in just a bit. So cultural competence and agility is recognizing where people come from, and how do you, as a supervisor, as a leader, as a recruiter, how do you interact with them in a way that demonstrates your competency, but actually gets people to feel comfortable to provide their best in the organization? Being cognizant of our unconscious bias. So by now, we all should recognize that we have bias, and not that it's so much our fault, but it is our responsibility to be conscious of it. It's our responsibility to manage and deal with our unconscious bias. And so when we think about that, there are two types of bias that we want to think about in terms of recruitment or hiring, right? And that is affinity bias, as well as our double standard bias, right? Or you can combine both of those to be the fit bias, right? The right fit bias. And so when we think about this bias, I want us to be cognizant of how we define this concept of bias. Right? So how do we define the fit of an organization? Is fit a degree? Is fit a certificate? Like, how does one measure if someone is the right fit? And so that unconscious bias of wanting someone who is like me, that I have an affinity with, that fits within our culture, fits within our organization, is that need for that affinity or that right fit congruent with the goals of the engagement, right? So do I need people in my organization that are just like me, or do I need people in my organization that will help us reach the goal? And sometimes those things do not come synonymous. They're not synonymous with one another, right? They can be opposite. And so when we think about that, we're really trying to be cognizant of our unconscious bias, our right fit bias, which includes our affinity bias as well as our double standard bias. And lastly, we want to talk about how do we develop a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is simply, how do we create psychological safety that people can bring their full and best selves to work, to reach goals and their fullest potential? So what, as a leader, as a supervisor, or even as a recruiter, how do I engage people in such a way that they want to give their very best selves? They feel comfortable bringing their very best selves into the workplace. And we also allow them to reach their fullest potential. So when we think about this, this creating a sense of belonging, we really want to focus on the psychological safety. We want to focus on the ability to have folks interact with each other so that they can bring out the best in each other so that we can reach organizational goals.